Hello, I'm Jeremy Fernandez. Tonight on The Virus, the cost of COVID-19. We take a look at what the key economic data released this week tells us about the nation's financial position. Plus, the new global growth zones, Russia and Brazil, battle to slow their infection rates. But first, the extent of the pandemic's effect on Australia's economy has been revealed. 594,000 jobs vanished in virus-related shutdowns last month, pushing the unemployment rate above 6%. The job losses are, however, only one area of concern. The Bureau of Statistics estimates 2.7 million Australians have been affected by the economic crunch, mostly in lost work hours or pay. The data is slightly better than expected. The government's JobKeeper package is being credited with keeping the number of jobless below the forecast 8.2%. But some economists are still worried the jobless rate will keep growing. The Reserve Bank is expecting the overall economy to shrink by 8% in the year to June. The budget, now due in October because of this upheaval, will be particularly challenging for the government. The Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, says things will get worse before they get better.
There is still a long way to go, and the economic numbers will get worse before they get better. Treasury's forecast is still for unemployment to reach around 10%, but importantly, Treasury have also said, but for the JobKeeper program, it would be 15%.
There have also been dire warnings for house prices this week. The Commonwealth Bank says prices could crash by 1/3. Even CBA's best case scenario is for a fall of more than 10%.
If Australia's biggest home lender is right, a prolonged downturn could see house prices crashing by 32%.
We also need to be prudent and consider both a realistic downturn scenario, but also to be planning for a worst case.
If CBA's dire prediction comes to pass, nearly $300,000 will be wiped off the median value of a home in Australia's most expensive city, which is Sydney. Even Darwin would see losses of well over $100,000.
And that has much worse implications, not just for the banks, but for the economy itself. Let's hope we're not going in that direction, but it is obviously a risk in the current environment.
What's already happened is that big bank dividends, which retirees in particular rely on, have been slashed by around $7 billion in the latest half. And if Commonwealth, which reports in a few months, adds to the cuts, it could take the figure to around $10 billion, a large amount of money in an economy which is shrinking at a record rate.
Incomes potentially are reduced by 30 or 40%, and at the moment they just can't see where they're going to have enough money to cover their living expenses.
The prospect of their houses being worth a lot less just adds to the gloomy scenario.
Well, all the data this week has been complicated by trade tensions with China. Beef exports from 4 major Australian abattoirs have been suspended, and tariffs are being introduced that will effectively end trade of Australian barley. Analysts are noting that China's restrictions follow Australia's call for an international investigation into the origins of the coronavirus outbreak. All up, Australian exports to China are worth $153 billion a year. So the affected industries are keen to ease the tensions quickly.
We don't really know how short or long this is going to take. Last time we went through this, it was 3 months. We're certainly believing that it's going to be shorter than that. So we're working to ensure that these things are rectified as soon as possible. I can't give a timeline because that's going to be up to China, obviously. However, we have stronger relationships than we ever had on an industry basis, and we'll be continuing to be working through those, which we haven't had in previous issues.
Well, the economic complications from the pandemic raise a lot of new questions. I put some of yours to the respected economist Saul Eslake and host of The Business, Elise Morgan. We've had a number of people asking these questions about how stable the markets are right now. One thing we haven't seen flow through is how these are affecting the profits of various companies, because we haven't had a reporting season yet, really, since this outbreak really took hold in Australia. Will that impact the confidence on the market further down the track as the economy absorbs the full shock of this pandemic?
We already are getting a bit of a flavour of that from the banks, and particularly for Commonwealth Bank. They report outside of the cycle. They just gave us this week a look at third quarter update, and it's not going to be great at all. And you consider that so many businesses have just gone into hibernation. We've got massive businesses like construction giant Mirvac looking to put a lot of its workers on JobKeeper. If you've got a huge company like that already trying to find financial assistance, when we haven't even really seen a big drop in construction yet, because I mean, there was a huge momentum going into this. We haven't seen the tail off yet. If they're already going and looking for help, then you can imagine that there will be some significant pain showing up when we finally get a look at the books.
Mining was really critical in helping getting Australia through the GFC. How badly affected is mining this time around, and particularly in consideration with the relationship we've got with China at the moment, which is, you know, fairly testy in terms of that bilateral trade?
Yeah, that's really a really interesting dimension of this, Jeremy. So far, mining seems to have been remarkably little affected. And although you're right to say that mining helped us out of the GFC, when the GFC first struck, the mining industry was very hard hit. Commodity prices plunged and companies put investment plans on hold. And then, of course, we had this massive fiscal stimulus from China that allowed the mining industry to rebound very strongly, and along with our own fiscal and monetary policy stimulus was one of the things that helped us be, I think, one of only 3 countries among advanced economies not to have experienced a recession by the normal definition of that term during the financial crisis. But this time around, although oil prices have plummeted, and that probably spells difficulties for LNG prices that are linked to oil on the spot market, the other commodity prices that really matter to Australia have held up remarkably well.
Saul, how great is the risk of long-term unemployment for these people who found themselves either unemployed or underemployed?
Well, the risk is greater the longer the shutdown lasts, or if it happens to be reinstated. We certainly saw very clearly after the recession of the early 1990s that, first of all, it took a lot longer for unemployment to fall than it did for unemployment to rise. And secondly, that those who were unemployed for a long time, for more than 12 months, found it increasingly difficult to get back into work. And if they were able to get back into work, it was usually at significantly lower pay. And that's why it is important that the government does what it can, and it has been doing what it can at considerable expense to keep people connected with jobs.
Elise, a lot of this, as Saul said, is being put down to JobKeeper, just buffering those numbers a little bit. Is it inevitable that we will see much greater unemployment further down the track?
That is a key concern, that once that JobKeeper program rolls off, if we don't see a lift in spending, a lift in activity, enough for employers to be able to afford those staff without that government subsidy, it is likely that there will be another spike in unemployment. Saul, do you concur?
Well, yes, I think that is right, that if there is a risk of a significant increase in unemployment if when the job seeker program expires, if it does, as currently scheduled in the last Friday in September, that people currently being kept on payrolls by the JobKeeper program will become effectively unemployed. Whether they show up as unemployed in the labour force survey obviously depends on whether they're actively looking for work, as the ABS defines it. Clearly that's a risk, and that's why I think the government will need to consider other forms of fiscal stimulus to replace the job seeker payment, assuming that it does terminate when they end. And they could be more traditional forms of fiscal stimulus, such as temporary increases in grants to first homeowners or infrastructure programs.
I want to ask you a question that a lot of people have been writing into us wondering about. Are house prices going to crash? And I think we get a lot of this question because a lot of people have their personal wealth, their private wealth, tied up in real estate. So, Elise, are house prices going to dramatically fall? You see the predictions of up to 32% by CBA this week, depending on how long this pandemic and the crisis lasts for. What's your view? What should people consider in assessing that?
Look, I'll give you the range from the major banks. I mean, these are the guys that have got the most skin in the game when it comes to whether or not house prices in Australia crash, because they're the ones that have lent all the money out. So from Westpac, they've got their base case is for a 20% decline in house prices from this year to next year. ANZ's predicting 12. The Commonwealth Bank's base case is for 11. The worst case is 32% fall, and the National Australia Bank is predicting 12% over the next 2 years.
They're all over the place.
They're the range.
Yeah.
And these guys are the so-called experts. They are looking into every part of our lives. They know what we're spending, where we're spending, how much we're saving, and how much into the red we are. They also know that about businesses in the economy. All of the small businesses that are really the engine room of this country, they're the largest employer as a group. That is really going to dictate what's going on.
Saul, I'll get your weigh in on that, on whether house prices are heading south, and when will we know if we're at the bottom of it?
We'll see some increased selling pressure coming from that proportion of existing homeowners or investors who've taken mortgage repayment holidays. Apparently about 9% of people with mortgages have taken up the offer to defer repayments until the end of September. There's that deadline again. Also affects the mortgage market, and those people are going to face higher or longer repayment periods when that mortgage repayment holiday is over, because banks haven't been foregoing or cancelling the interest. They've instead been adding it to the outstanding principal. And there'll no doubt be a number, probably not a big number, but there'll be some people who find themselves in a position where they've got higher mortgage repayments but still haven't got the sort of income they had when they first took the loan out. Some of those may become forced sellers, and there may be other investors who'd been counting on renting out their investment properties as B&Bs rather than long-term tenancies, and that's probably not going to be coming back in the same way as it had for an extended period of time. So I think we'll see some selling pressure from that source. On the buying side, it may well be that people are more nervous about how secure their employment is or how secure their income is going to be if they've returned to work but aren't working the sort of hours that they had been before this outbreak started. So I think there'll also be some downward pressure on demand, and in that environment it stands to reason that house prices are more likely to fall than rise. I suspect if it looks as though house prices are going to rise by amounts at the lower end of that range that Elise mentioned, something between 20 and 30%, then you'll probably find turnover drying up, and that people who don't have to sell will simply take their properties off the market in the hope that if they wait another year or so, they'll get a better price. And so the market may become a little bit artificial. But I certainly think it's reasonable to expect that house prices will decline some as the market reopens, and probably remain on a downward path until the outlook for migration in particular becomes clearer than it is at the moment.
Saul Eslake there. Well, Australia's case rate of coronavirus infections continues to fluctuate around 20 new cases a day. As you can see, over the past month, we have had days where there have been fewer than 10 infections. However, small clusters have kept the figures around 20 a day. All in all, health authorities are content with the progress that's being made, which means restrictions are continuing to be wound back all over the country. Another reason for the optimism is Australia's recovery rate, which stands at 90%. There are around 600 active cases, but only 50 of those people are in hospital. The government has acknowledged the impact goes a lot further, so it's pledged $48 million towards a broader national mental health plan.
First a city, then a country, then the world. With reports of deaths on most continents and no vaccine in sight, the questions remain. How far will the virus spread? How many lives will it take?
Many other countries are still grappling with increasing infection rates. Overall, there are almost 4.5 million cases and more than 300,000 deaths. Russia, Brazil and India all have rising infection rates, although the US still accounts for the vast majority of the outbreak and its case rate remains persistently high. The number of confirmed cases in Russia is now consistently above 10,000 a day. Government officials say the death rate there remains low because of widespread testing. However, the official numbers are being questioned. The virus has spread to all tiers of Russian society. Its Prime Minister, the President's spokesman and several ministers have either been admitted to hospital or gone into isolation. Russia now has the second highest number of infections behind the US. More than 250,000 cases have been confirmed. Hospitals outside the big cities are struggling to cope. Doctors have complained about shortages of protective equipment and poor quality ventilators. The government insists the country only has isolated cases of COVID-19. Despite the rising number of infections, factory and construction workers are being sent back to work. The shockwaves from the hospital floors are reverberating all the way to the Kremlin. Vladimir Putin's approval rating has slipped to its lowest level since 2013. He's now ruled the country for more than 20 years, and analysts say his handling of this pandemic will directly steer his future. And Brazil's also causing concern. It's the hardest hit country in Latin America, and infection numbers there are climbing every single day. At the last count, there were 14,000 new cases. There are more than 200,000 known cases and around 14,000 deaths. What's making matters worse is the stance of the President, Jair Bolsonaro. After city and state governments introduced lockdowns to ease pressure on hospitals, he wants those orders lifted to help the economy, saying job losses are more damaging than COVID-19. Meanwhile, further north, another leader is at odds with the advice of experts. For months, Dr. Anthony Fauci has been appearing alongside the US President, Donald Trump, as a member of the White House Coronavirus Task Force. This week, America's top infectious diseases specialist told a Senate committee that a premature lifting of lockdowns would lead to further outbreaks, and he said the health of children would be at risk if schools were to reopen too early. President Trump says he was surprised by that assessment, saying it's not an acceptable answer. Here in Australia, millions of litres of beer is being poured down drain in an unfortunate flow-on effect of the coronavirus crisis. Even though some clubs and pubs are reopening, the strict customer limits mean the good stuff is going off in kegs.
When the government called last drinks, Luke Hiscox was gutted. And the Sydney pub he runs with his family was stuck with thousands of dollars of beer in kegs.
A lot of them were really rare and special beers. They may not last 6 months or 12 months.
Desperate not to let it go off, Luke Hiscox bought a canning machine to transfer keg beer into tinnies to sell through his bottle shop. But for many pubs, that's not an option, and millions of litres is being dumped.
A bit of a national tragedy, isn't it, if you're losing kegs down the drain?
One of the things that we don't really think a lot about with beer, we don't think of beer as having a shelf life, and it's a fairly short shelf life at that.
The two industry giants, Lion and Carlton and United Breweries, are crediting or refunding venues for the cost of their unused kegs. The ABC understands Lion will have to empty about 90,000 kegs, or more than 10 million schooners of beer. Most of it will be treated to make biogas, but both Lion and CUB may have to pour some down the drain.
I've seen estimations of millions of litres, and it seems very un-Australian and certainly heartbreaking. It's probably even worse than a beer truck falling over on a highway.
Those who know the industry say the big brewers are better off tipping the beer out rather than keeping it and paying the government excise. And until pubs reopen to large numbers of drinkers, brewers are trying to stay afloat. Will Tatchell's small Tasmanian brewery spent $25,000 on bottles to avoid wasting keg beer. He says adapting his business model is crucial to surviving the coronavirus slump.
There are means and ways about it. It's just thinking forward, thinking positively and staying ahead of the curve, pardon the pun, in this situation.
Crafting new paths in unprecedented times.
Well, thanks for joining us on tonight's program. If you want to see more of that Q&A session with Saul Estlake and Elise Morgan, you can check out the ABC News YouTube and Facebook channels. Good night.